what I want to talk about tonight is the subject of a new book project that I'm going to be working on while I'm here as a Humboldt Fellow in Munich. I'm going to be spending some time here in Munich over the next 3 years and hope to make some progress on what is now just a very beginning stage. And what I'm going to focus on and hope to have your responses to is the larger conceptual framework for that project, which is implicitly comparative, although my focus is very much Imperial Russia. It's about the growth of the state in Europe in the early modern period, how some states emerged in a position of strength, while others, so mainly those in Northwest and Western Central Europe, emerged in a position of strength, while others, most everywhere else, did not. Like Russia, they remained weak, and what the implications of this weakness were for political and economic reform and economic growth and development. I'm going to suggest that reform in Imperial Russia was challenging and often ineffective, and that's with respect to the state's own goals, because of the weakness of the central state vis-a-vis other corporative interest groups. Now, I realize that strong and weak are not very precise terms, and I also realize that referring to the Tsarist state as weak may seem counterintuitive in some ways. I do think it's going to be important as the project takes shape to make these terms more precise, make the language more precise, and I'm happy to entertain any suggestions or ideas for doing that later. But let me say right now, just in the hope that you won't be distracted by this terminology as I go on, that what I have in mind in a general sense is that a strong state is one that has the capacity to enforce its own policies and its own agenda, to enforce the laws, and especially fiscal policy. Strong states were able to enforce their tax policies, to collect the taxes they levied. And of course, early modern states levied all kinds of taxes. What they actually managed to get is a different story. So stronger states could levy those taxes and enforce the policy. Weak states, on the other hand, were forced to rely on cooperation from other powerful competing groups within their societies. And this cooperation often required considerable concessions, concessions which constrained the extent to which revenues could be raised, which was the chief concern of states in this period. So weak states found themselves in a sort of vicious circle. They were unable to override strong corporative groups because they didn't have the resources. But in order to obtain the resources, they had to override the interests of those very groups. This idea of strong and weak, I think, should be seen as a continuum. The categories are not absolute. We wouldn't sort of necessarily say that any state belonged in the strong category or the weak category. All early modern states, and in fact, I think you could say all modern states, exhibit some characteristics of strength and weakness. It does seem to be the case that there was a gradient, however. There was a tipping point. And I'm not in a position to try and pinpoint that here tonight. But for instance, while the early modern French state may have looked like Imperial Russia in many ways, you can't say the French didn't have to negotiate with strong corporative interest groups of their own making in a similar sense. It also had a strength, at least from Louis XIV on, in certain areas, such as fiscal capacity, that seems to have eluded the Russian czars. And I would argue that that difference in strength put France, for instance, on a very different developmental trajectory. So before I sketch out this idea of Russia as a weak state, let me just offer a bit of background or say a few words about the motivation for the project, about what got me interested in this, what took me from serfdom to this political history project, political economy. I'm an economic historian, and like the work on serfdom, this study is motivated by similar questions. So an interest in the conditions that fostered the unprecedented growth in economies and rise in living standards in some places in the 18th and 19th century. And then the question of why this transition happened in some places and not others. The changes occurred first in Northwest Europe and then spread to much of Western Europe by the end of the 19th century. It's often talked about as a divergence. We talk about the Great Divergence between Europe and Asia, Europe and the rest of the world. And economic historians also talk about the Little Divergence, which was Northwest Europe from the rest of Europe. Now, there have been a number of explanations put forth for these diverging trajectories. I think I'm going to talk about three of the most widespread. The first I would call a geographical explanation. And geographical explanations are the ones that suggest some places had more favorable climates than others. Some places had better soil conditions. Some places had, they benefited from proximity to waterways or trade routes, or their territories were a more optimal size. And that these geographical advantages were the key to prosperity in those places. I think even more widespread are what I'll call cultural explanations. These take a multitude of forms. Many are modern variations on a Weberian theme. Northwest Europe, England in particular, is often focused on as having had a more entrepreneurial culture than other places, or Western culture was more individualistic than Eastern, which is viewed as more collectivist, communalist. Other versions of this view explicitly invoke mentalities and different attitudes. Again, East Europeans, for instance, had what some see as extreme versions of a peasant mentality, avoiding market transactions, avoiding risk at any cost, preferring safer communalistic institutions to individualistic ones, and so on. Finally, there are institutional explanations, and these are the ones that I personally find most convincing, and for which I've found the most evidence in my own work. These posit that a society's institutional framework is what shapes its political and economic trajectory. Well, you might ask, what do we mean by an institution? Economists tend to define institution very narrowly. They're mainly forms of property rights and contract enforcement mechanisms. I think without getting too bogged down in semantics, one could broaden this a bit to something like institutions are the rules by which a particular society is governed. They are the rules around which the society is organized. So yes, property rights and contract enforcement mechanisms are very, very important, as well as other aspects of rules and regulations, the state level, to the community level, to the household level, and anywhere in between. Another way of thinking about it is institutions create the incentives that people respond to. They influence the decisions people take in their daily lives about their livelihoods, within their livelihoods, as well as more personal things like when to marry, how many children to have, how you should organize your household. So, for instance, an institutional explanation for the Industrial Revolution might see entrepreneurship in England not as the result of a more entrepreneurially inclined culture or individualism, but as a response to an institutional framework that rewarded risk-taking and creativity, maybe through the existence of secure property rights, intellectual property rights, for instance, or markets, and the expectation that contracts would be enforced. When I began to study the Russian rural economy under serfdom, it was to look for evidence or to examine the evidence for these different explanations, different explanatory frameworks. And what I found, and just bear with me for a brief summary because it is relevant to this question I'm working toward, of state strength, was that contrary to the widespread view of the Russian peasantry is very traditional, communal, self-sufficient, there was actually enormous variation in the countryside, in economic behavior, in social behavior, even in demographic behavior. And that this variation seemed to be correlated to the institutional arrangements on different serf estates. So, for instance, where noble landlords allowed entrepreneurial activity, like on the estates of the Sheremetyev family, which I studied, where they provided dispute resolution services, where they enabled land and labor markets to function, we see serfs participating in an incredibly lively, dynamic local economy, engaging in land, labor, credit markets, engaging in an emerging European culture of consumption, clothing, household items, food. This is already in the early 19th century in rural Russia in Yaroslavl province. And we find a more variegated social structure, we find more variation in occupational structure, and even in things like demographic behavior, age at marriage, household size, and so on. Where landlords didn't allow such activities, where serfs were punished, for instance, for hiring laborers, for participating in markets. These are the sorts of estates, for instance, the Gagarin estates that Stephen Hoke studied. We find a much flatter sort of economic environment. We find a lot less entrepreneurial activity, except in getting around the rules. They're very entrepreneurial there, but a lot less entrepreneurial activity, more uniform poverty, less variation in occupational structure, considerably lower standards of living. Now, these findings got me thinking about political and economic reform, and in particular, the land reforms of the 1860s, and how to link these micro findings with the macro political economic context. It was evident that there was an enormous amount of entrepreneurial energy in the countryside that might have been freed in the process of emancipation. If the state had created an institutional framework that encouraged and supported economic innovation and entrepreneurship, like the one that I observed on a much smaller and informal scale on the Sheremetyev estates, then the rural transition that the Russian state hoped for, or at least the technocrats crafting the legislation, such as improvements in agricultural productivity, rising living standards, things that would expand and improve their tax base, those things had a very good chance of occurring. But what they did instead, at least in my view, is keep a lot of the worst features of serfdom, the features most damaging to growth and development, in place. So the reform strengthened communal tenure, it gave landlords considerable power over free tenants, it kept mobility restrictions in place, instead of a universal system of law, a kind of level playing field for transactions for everyone, it created a separate body of peasant law with special peasant courts and then a reliance on this nebulous concept called customary law that was clearly vague. It was obvious to those trying to enforce it that it was too vague for them to be able to make much sense of it, and it was easily manipulated by both sides. So in response to this observation, I made a rather strong statement at the end of the book on serfdom, one that sounded reasonable to me at the time. And what I wrote was, the monarchy certainly had the power that would have enabled it to promulgate and implement a legal system evolving toward the universal enforcement of contracts and property rights. But it did not. My view at that time was that the state could have gone much further in freeing the peasantry from its obligated status, but that they bungled the reform. Partly due to insufficient resources. They had been relying on revenues from issuing stocks and bonds, didn't expect a banking crisis and a European-wide downturn in the 1850s. They'd hoped to undertake a Prussian-style emancipation, that they would have the funds to do that. But partly due to pressure from ideologues, like for instance, prominent Slavophiles who were very invested in the notion of communalism, and in particular, communal land tenure and communal land tenure as the basis for a newly organized society. Well, since writing that, I've moved a bit away from that view, or at least from that particular formulation of it. I've become more and more convinced that the Russian state actually did not have the power in 1861 to effect the reform it wanted to. That the state in Russia was, and I would even say has remained to a large extent, surprisingly weak in the way I described earlier. And it was for that reason that the Emancipation Act, like most attempts at reform in Russian history, was a watered-down compromise. It was characterized primarily by concessions to other powerful competing interest groups, nobles, merchants, even rural communes, which my own research suggests wielded a great deal of authority locally. Now, to explore this possibility, we have to think about the Russian case in the context of the growth of central states in the early modern period. What I'm suggesting, that the Russian state was weak vis-a-vis other powerful groups in the society, was true, as I mentioned earlier, to some extent for all states in the past. But at some point, and the turning point is often seen as the 17th century, though states' trajectories varied considerably, a number of states in Western Europe somehow got the upper hand and managed to override other powerful competing groups to a greater extent than they'd been able to do before, and most importantly, to commandeer more of the society's resources for themselves. They were able to use these resources to wage war more successfully, as well as to have bigger and better parties and more opulent buildings and the things rulers did, but to build an infrastructure which better enabled the enforcement of their rule over the rest of society. And this in turn enabled them to get even better at capturing resources. In other words, creating new tax regimes and enforcing those regimes and collecting taxes. Now, there are a lot of reasons why we might be interested in this process as historians. I want to draw attention to one which links back to my original comment about my motivation as an economic historian. It does seem to be the case that the greatest growth and development, the greatest rises in living standards for ordinary people, occurred in those places where a central state emerged in this period. A state with the power to enforce laws and protect property for everyone, and to command resources which could be used eventually for the investment in a sort of public infrastructure. Now, How exactly this happened, I think, is still a bit of a mystery. Most historians and social scientists have converged on a view that emphasizes competition among polities within Europe, so political, economic, territorial competition. The military revolution, it's usually seen as the process during which states in Western Europe managed to get the upper hand over their local competitors. They were able to force through new fiscal policies in the face of external threats. Interestingly, Russia, along with much of Eastern Europe, I think, has been neglected in this account. Most Europeanists have readily accepted the view put forth by Jeffrey Parker some time ago and by others, I'm sure as well, that Russia wasn't really competing militarily in this period with other European powers. Russia's main preoccupations were Mongols, other potential conquerors to the south, and their mode of warfare was very different. So say cavalry and bows as opposed to armies and guns, and so there was very little incentive for the Russian state to enter this tournament, to revolutionize in the same way. I think that's a very convenient narrative, but as many of us in this room know, it's not consistent with the evidence for this period. If we look at the reign of Peter I alone, we see Russia was very concerned with the military might of Western neighbors, such as Sweden to the north, the Ottoman Empire to the south, and of course, Russia is regularly engaged in warfare with them and drawn into various European conflicts in this period. The question of how to improve Russia's ability to fend off outside threats was one that continually preoccupied Peter and his advisors, and of course, subsequent Russian rulers. So, why is it then that the Russian state did not manage to harness this military competition, these potential external threats to its existence, to improve its own fiscal capacity and its own strength at home? I'm not claiming to have a definite answer, but I think one variable that deserves more attention concerns the strength of internal threats to a state's existence, or more precisely, internal threats to a particular ruler's existence. The extent to which a state could channel resources toward fending off external enemies, external threats, or engaging in conflicts with them, depended on both the strength of the external threat. So if you're Louis XIII surrounded by Habsburgs, you have a potentially very strong threat. So it depends on the strength of the external threat relative to the strength of internal local competitors for power. If an external threat was serious enough relative to the internal competition, the likelihood was greater that a state could harness that threat to effect certain fiscal and political changes that would benefit itself. In the case of Russia, and I think this is probably true for other parts of Eastern and Southern Europe, maybe Poland, for instance, the existential threat from within was great and ever-present, and it significantly constrained the state's ability to commandeer greater resources for itself in the way that the English, the Dutch, the French, that other European competitors, the Swedes, were doing at this time. Now, I think, this is, again, bear in mind, kind of view from 30,000 feet. I'm sketching out a broad framework here. I think the political history of Imperial Russia lends kind of a superficial general support to this view. As we know, threats to the crown are well documented and actually not infrequently resulted in political coup d'etat. So if we think of the time of troubles as a particularly glaring example of ongoing internal political conflict, but even after the troubles quiet down, the Romanovs are put on the throne, you still get these ruling clans, these ruling elites vying for power. So you have the battle between the Miloslavsky and Orishkin families behind the power struggle between Sofia Alexeyevna and Peter I. You have the even more obvious example of the deposing of Peter III and the ascension of Catherine II. All of these very obvious examples are ones of intrigue and plotting at the highest levels, of division and conflict among the ranks of the powerful elite, who were capable of undermining the authority of the crown, and even, in these instances, of bringing down the reigning monarch and putting their own person in power. If we wanted to push back further in time, why stop here? I'm on a roll. We could go back to, we could look at the reign of the Rurikids and see it in a similar light. So one interpretation of Ivan the Terrible's brutal oprichnina, the repressive policy toward the aristocracy, which resulted in banishment, execution, confiscation of lands from ruling aristocratic families, is as a response, admittedly an extreme response, to perceived threats from within the ruling hierarchy. So internal instability, internal threats to power. That these threats were real to Russian rulers is evident, I think, or I would hypothesize, in the way they ruled. There were always concessions from the crown to powerful competitors, as there were in all medieval and early modern societies. There was the promotion of noble favorites to boyar status, which Robert Crummy has argued gained momentum at the start of the Romanov rule, interestingly. So time of troubles has just ended, new Tsar on the throne, the internal conflict fresh in everyone's mind. How can we appease potential competitors? What kinds of things can we give them? There were, marriage was used as a way of placating potential competitors. I think this strategy has most recently been described convincingly by Russell Martin in the book A Bride for the Tsar. One of the most significant concessions was the institution of serfdom itself. Where states in Western Europe were becoming strong enough by the 17th century to compete with landholding nobles, to undermine their authority, to compete with them jurisdictionally, offer peasants the right to use state courts, for instance, compete with them for rents, for money. The states in Eastern Europe and parts of Central Europe were still very dependent on their support and cooperation. In the Russian case, the cost of noble participation in military campaigns was the enforcement of mobility restrictions on peasant laborers, which then gradually over time gave way to full jurisdiction over the rural inhabitants of their estates in exchange for noble administration of state tax and conscription policy in the countryside. But perhaps even more revealing is what the state didn't do. It does not appear to have pushed significant reforms that were unpopular with powerful groups, such as the emancipation of the serfs, which, as you know, was on the cards, on the table, at least a century before it actually happened. And it only finally happened after the Habsburgs did it, after it was done in Prussia, after the Baltic states emancipated their serfs. the state does not appear to have consistently enforced laws that targeted these groups. For instance, the laws on the books prohibiting the maltreatment of serfs or the sale of serfs apart from land were largely ignored by noble landlords in this period without consequence, as far as one can see from the estate records from the 18th and 19th century. A very interesting new study by Igor Fedjuk and Elena Kochmina at Vyshka on the poll tax collection in the provinces, the Padushny Poditye. They use evidence for Ryazan province, and they're able to demonstrate that arrears in poll taxes were far, far lower than the Soviet literature is implied. So actually, the state was collecting the head tax on serfs. On these grounds, they argue that the state under Peter I was fiscally effective. However, the slight problem with that is we don't know what would have happened if Peter had tried to raise that tax, which was, by the way, not very high relative to incomes of, say, a middling peasant. It was under a ruble. Would the state have still been able to collect as effectively at a higher level? Well, we could interpret Peter's unwillingness to try and find out as a sign that he thought it was actually unlikely. He was desperate to raise revenues for the state. If anyone was keenly aware of the military competition and what was happening in Western Europe, it was Peter in this period. But he didn't go in that direction. He resorted mainly to new forms of indirect taxation, taxing consumption at the margins. Don't raise taxes on the serfs. The problem was that the state was competing with nobles for money from the serfs, for those rents. If the state pushed too far and tried to take too much, the nobility could push back, and the state needed them, not only to keep them in power, not only to keep them supportive and prevent any possible coup, but for successful military campaigns, and for rural administration and tax collection. So I think, even despite his reputation as the Tsar reformer, I would venture, perhaps controversially, that in economic terms, or in terms of state capacity and fiscal capacity, Peter didn't actually move things that far. He didn't push the existing equilibrium very far in a different direction, especially relative to the changes he wished to achieve on the basis of his own observations of Western Europe in the 17th and 18th centuries. And his successors faced the same obstacles in their attempts. Now, the Russian state had an additional problem, and it was endogenous to the situation I've just outlined. The concessions made to these groups to keep them from undermining state authority or to get them to do something for the state empowered them further. The Russian state, in its, I think, long history of juggling external and internal threats, was always constrained in its ability to raise revenue. Its existence was largely hand-to-mouth, though I realize it may not look that way when you've seen all of the palaces and views the opulent artifacts of the period, but actually for running the machinery of state, the Russians were always looking for ways to raise revenue. It never managed to harness the resources required, for instance, to create a kind of legal infrastructure, a civil service, which was integrated into a framework for law enforcement and tax collection. In short, Russia was a relatively poor state with a vast territory to administer. It had to improvise ways of low-cost administration. Grant the nobles jurisdiction over their land, and over their peasants, and have them keep order, collect taxes, administer conscription in the countryside. Have peasants hold their land in collective tenure, and make them collectively responsible as a group for taxes and dues. Landlords could then delegate to communal officials the responsibility for the village administration. So everything is sort of delegated down in this way. Trade could be regulated through merchant organizations. They paid the state for the privilege of engaging in commerce, and then, in order to protect this privilege, they monitored the trade of, or harassed, non-guild members. Now, this was not an entirely unique approach to administration. It's worth pointing out that China, for instance, continued to use communal responsibility, communes for local administration for many of the same reasons, in the same way, in this period. What this solution to the administrative problem does, though, is make it very difficult to implement changes to the structure of society later on. So these groups all became invested in retaining their privileges, or their rents, as economists call the proceeds from such privileges, and they were powerful enough to thwart attempts to take them away. Okay, so the view from 1861. This is the institutional equilibrium Russia found itself in at the time of the 1861 Emancipation Act. There was a brief period in the 1850s when the state may have been able to put itself in a somewhat stronger negotiating position. The period when Russia's inability to compete militarily with Western Europe was becoming painfully clear, and reform seemed to everyone unavoidable. When the Russian state thought that it would have the resources to implement a Prussian-style reform, freeing peasants with land, paying off landlords. As I mentioned, banking crisis, financial downturn made these plans impossible and weakened the state's position further. To complicate matters and further weaken their position, there was the realization as they embarked on reform that the plans they'd made were actually unrealizable in the existing Russian administrative framework. In other words, they lacked this infrastructure at the most basic level. Even if they possessed the financial resources to compensate nobles for the loss of land and labor, how would they do this? There was no imperial cadastre they could use to determine boundaries. There was no general knowledge of land prices. The system of serfdom had for so long undermined the functioning of land and labor markets. That's not to say that there weren't prices and these transactions didn't happen. They were recorded locally. It would have been a huge and expensive undertaking for the state to collate, verify, and analyze this information on the eve of emancipation. Finally, there was no system of administration in the localities to accommodate a new and substantial population of peasant freeholders, the newly freed peasantry. Courts had to be created, tax collectors needed to be hired and trained, land surveys undertaken. The absence of an infrastructure, an absence due to a chronic lack of resources, thwarted their attempts at reform even in the most auspicious circumstances. So the state gets to this point where finally everyone agrees something has got to be done. Serfdom's untenable, everyone else is freeing their serfs, and they find that the hand-to-mouth existence they've had to this point, the solution they've devised for their administration problems actually prohibits them from using the political capital they have at this moment. So in the end, the 1861 reform results in another set of compromises and concessions. The state hoped to free the peasants with land, raise productivity, expand its tax base, it turned out, as I said, that even if they'd had the resources, they'd still have to continue their reliance on local powers for administrative support, since there was no existing infrastructure to fill this role. So, in other words, the Russian state is still too weak to put through a reform on terms that it wanted. As a result, nobles, communes, communal elites, merchants too, to some extent, emerged from this reform with their positions largely intact. Nobles got to choose which lands they'd give up and what they were worth. They were to receive payment for them, and peasants remained in temporary obligation. In some parts of the empire, peasants were still required to pay, to perform corvée labor services, even after emancipation. Mobility restrictions meant that labor costs would remain low for landlords, since peasants weren't going to be allowed to up and leave. Now you're free in name, you're nominally free, but you can't go anywhere. You need a passport and permission, and you're tied to this land. This benefited nobles. Communal land tenure and communal liability meant that communal elites continued to wield authority, and they continued to benefit from the power to allocate these tax burdens and land among member households. Merchants, they weren't formally part of the legislative process, but they too benefited from restrictions on peasant mobility and from peasants' ties to communal land, as well as their new legal status as peasants, because all of these things constrained the extent to which peasants would be able to compete in trade in towns and cities. So the previous equilibrium, this institutional configuration, actually changed very little after 1861. And unfortunately, peasants also emerged from the reform with their status largely intact. They were nominally free, they'd been emancipated, but they were still bound to their communes, forced to hold communal land, which, because it was not held in individual tenure, could not be used as loan collateral and made it very difficult for them to access credit, just as it had earlier. They were subject to restrictions on their mobility, so not only did the state require passports, but because of communal liability, the whole commune has to pay for the land together. The communal authorities got to decide who could leave for how long and when, because you didn't want to run the risk of someone running away from their payments. They were in debt to their landlords and the state, and they were restricted in their economic activities by all these things. Their lack of individual land tenure, individual property, and their peasant legal designation. So the same balance of power that had gone into the creation of the system ensured that what emerged from the negotiations over the terms of the Emancipation Act would serve many of the same interests and perpetuate many of the worst features of the pre-emancipation system. The state authorities continued to be incapable of raising revenues beyond what they urgently needed. And I think one or the main reason for that was precisely this system of interlocking dependencies that they had largely created themselves, which stifled economic activity, or at least kept much of it in the informal sector. Government, in this way, this kind of what would you call it? This kind of corporative, I suppose, approach was by privilege and compromise. Laws were not applied equally. There wasn't a uniform body of law that applied to all citizens equally. Without clearly defined property rights, without access to a formal system of dispute resolution that provided a level playing field for everyone, even the most entrepreneurial Russian peasants were unlikely to undertake the kinds of innovative projects that made the Industrial Revolution happen in England and other, that led to the kind of dynamism we saw in Northwest Europe in this period, and enabled those societies to ultimately break out of the vicious circle I'm describing for Russia. No matter how economically entrepreneurial, no matter how entrepreneurial or dynamic things were at the local level, in this framework, it could never translate into prosperity for the society, because you always had these groups waiting to seize the surpluses. There would always be some agreement whereby whatever was achieved, whatever was raised, was divided up by these powerful groups. Now, before I conclude briefly, I just want to point out again here that this is a rough sketch from 30,000 feet. I am very much aware that in reality, these were not, for instance, monolithic groups. The state, the nobility, the peasants, there were clearly different interests represented within, and benefits accrued to some and losses to others, even within the same broadly defined corporative entity. But I don't think that undermines the larger framework for thinking about these political dynamics and the way that they shaped the economic and political trajectory of Russia in this period, and of societies relative to one another in this period. And with regard to those dynamics, in the end, as I said, the existing equilibrium was at best only nudged slightly in a different direction in 1861. This is the institutional inertia that I was referring to in the title of the talk. That the state itself saw the outcome as unsatisfactory is to some extent confirmed, I think, by the fact that less than half a century later, they sat down again to devise a new set of land reforms with very much the same aims as the last set, the later called Stolypin reforms, which were supposed to finally create a peasant class of smallholders and create prosperity in the countryside and release this dynamism. These reforms were not a resounding success either, in the way the state had hoped. And though the details are well beyond the scope of this particular paper and we're out of time, I do think they were subject to the same kind of inertia that I've described here, though perhaps in a slightly different form. In this case, it's the commune that's been empowered through the concessions in the 1861 Emancipation Act that is able to undermine the attempts of the Stolypin reforms to break peasant households off from the communes. Okay, so to wrap up, I just want to say a few brief words about why we might want to think about these questions that I've raised here. Why might it be worth viewing Russian political history or imperial political economy from this particular angle? So none of the specific things I've said is new, or it's more the way we might think about this, or reinterpreting it in this particular way. Well, I think there are a few reasons, but I'll focus on two. One is more general, and I guess one is more specific to Russia. First, I don't think we understand very well how strong states emerged in the early modern period, and what exactly that connection was to early economic growth and development. Modern development economists and political scientists take for granted that in the contemporary world, this correlation is real and significant. We hear about failed states regularly and about the economic and political consequences of those. I think looking empirically at the strengths and weaknesses of states historically, in a historical context, can help us shed light on, additional light on these very important, very urgent development questions, and also maybe help us think a bit better about how societies can make a transition from one institutional equilibrium to another. We know quite a bit, or there are certainly lots of social science models of good and bad equilibria, institutional equilibria and their outcomes. But there's really no persuasive account, I think, of how a shift occurs. How do you get from one point, and this is the question, this is always the question with regard to reform, isn't it? How do you actually, we have a general sense of the kinds of things that are good for political stability and economic growth, but how do you make those happen? How do you get from the point where society is to this new institutional arrangement? A comparative approach, I think, would be very useful here. And one advantage of this framework, as I've called it, that I've sketched out, is that while it is really general, it can accommodate a wide range of variation. So, it's not a formal model. It is, in fact, incredibly important that we put empirical flesh on these frameworks. Strong and weak states were often strong and weak in quite different ways. And I think it's really important to try and understand the range of variation there. And then the second, I think, is that this is a way of thinking about the trajectory of Russia that in many ways emphasizes continuity over time. There are a lot of our accounts of Russian history place the emphasis on discontinuities, uprisings, revolutions, and so on. In many ways, Russia, counterintuitive as it may sound, still exhibits the qualities of a weak state. Preoccupied with internal threats to power, unable to consistently enforce its own laws, and hence seemingly unlimited scope for corruption, ruled by a coalition of powerful groups at the expense of the larger society. This is a variation on an old theme. And I think thinking about the long history of the Russian state in this kind of framework can help us better understand what we observe now and think about the possibilities that exist for this kind of a transition to a different institutional configuration. Thank you.
Thank you very much.